Hello, this is a quick walkthrough of the practice test 2. This is being recorded for spring of 26, and this is class 12. So this is the class that covers two topics in the psychology of critical thinking. We cover perception and memory, and then in the traditional philosophical approach to critical thinking, we talk about arguments by analogy. We also talk about burden of proof and some other fallacies associated with presumption, such as circular reasoning. So let's just run through these. The first few questions are multiple choice, either select one or select several, as before. First question says, which is the best definition of a cognitive bias as the term is used in this course? Cognitive bias was actually a term, was also on the previous test. It's one of our basic terms for the psychological approach to critical thinking. It should be on your review sheet here, and hopefully you took notes on it. So we can run through these. The part of the meaning of a term that conveys information, that doesn't sound like anything we've studied. We can rule that one out pretty quickly. A prejudice against someone because they belong to a stigmatized group. Well, no, but you might think that if you just heard the word bias and hadn't been doing anything else in this course, that might be a thing you would guess. The last two are an argument which appears to be good in some way, valid, strong, or cogent, but really is not, and a widespread systematic distortion in the way people think. This is often not a matter of explicit belief. These are the two answers that are most likely. The correct answer is the last one, a widespread distortion in the way people think. That's because this is a cognitive bias is a part of the psychological approach to critical thinking. And so we're dealing here with things that aren't always a matter of explicit belief, but distort your thinking. The answer directly above it is the definition of a fallacy. Fallacy is a parallel term used in the philosophical discussion of critical thinking. Okay, so the way I structure these multiple choice questions, some answers are more wrong than others. So if you guess one of the first two, I would think that you were completely guessing, and it would take off full credit, or maybe only give you 3 points. This one, since it is a thing we discussed, fallacies, and it is related, would only be 4 points off. Continuing. Which of the following are examples of perceptual constancies? So this again should be on your review sheet. When we're talking about perception, we talk about the ways in which perception is actually like inference. It involves a fair amount of reconstruction from the data given. Perceptual constancies were things that you perceive as being the same, even though your input keeps changing. So, for instance, when you observe an object getting closer, you perceive it as staying the same size, even though the image on your retina is getting closer, right? So if I put this review sheet up to the screen, it takes up more and more of the screen, but you don't think it's growing, you think it's getting closer. And that's just part of how your brain turns the 2D image on the back of your retina into a 3D picture of the world. Okay, so when you observe an ambiguous image, such as the vase that could also be two faces, your perception can change, even though the stimulus on your retina does not. This is the reverse of a perceptual constancy, so this is a wrong answer. Perceptual constancy is something that stays the same even though the input changes. Here's something where the input stays the same and the perception changes. So you don't want that. When you close your eyes, you can still see little blots of color because we are always perceiving something. Now, that's just a distractor. That's just something I made up. When you hear a car alarm go off, you perceive the noise as constant because it is annoying. Again, that's just something I made up that you might think if you were just trying to play off the word constancy, but it's not actually there. The other example that we discussed in class is perceiving a rotating three-dimensional object. So this pencil you perceive as a line. Now you see, I'm sorry, the image on your retina is a line. The image on your retina here is a circle, but you don't perceive the object as changing shape. You perceive it as rotating in three-dimensional space, right? So again, perceptual constancies are about how your mind changes the two-dimensional image on your retina back into a three-dimensional image. And what that means is you perceive some things as staying the same, even though the two-dimensional image is changing. Okay, so that was perception. We talked about cognitive bias. We talked about perception. Now we're going to talk about memory. Your memory is biased. That's just the way it is. So every stage involved in remembering something actually has its own bias to it. So this question just asks you to identify the biases in the different stages of memory. Actually, you could answer this pretty quickly, but if you just remember what the stages of memory are, which were encoding, when you first make the memory, storage, when it sits in your brain, and recollection, when you recall it. These other two, synchronization and flashbacks, are not actual stages of memory. But we can, just to double check our answer, we can read in further and be sure that these are the actual biases. So encoding is biased by your perceptual set. This is something we discussed. That is, your expectations you have about what you perceive. When we talked about perception, we talked about how you tend to perceive what you think you should be perceiving. Your expectations bias your perceptions. This then becomes a part of your memory. So the encoding of your memory had this bias in it to begin with. Storage is also biased because you're constantly rewriting your old stored memories based on what makes the most sense to you. And then recollection is biased because of the framing effect in the context that you remember things. So how you ask someone a question can affect how they remember things. If you ask them, how long was the movie, you get a different answer than if you ask, how short was the movie. How fast were the cars going when they contacted each other? It's a different answer than how fast were the cars going when they rammed into each other. All right. Question 4 is about standards of proof. Which of the following is true of the reasonable doubt standard of proof? Remember, the reasonable doubt standard of proof is the standard of proof that is used in American criminal cases. You have to prove that something is true beyond a reasonable doubt. And this was different from some of the other standards of proof that we looked at, such as deductive validity and preponderance of evidence. So under the reasonable doubt standard, the premises cannot be true and the conclusion false. We know that is not a correct answer because that is the standard for deductive validity. The reasonable doubt standard is equivalent to the deductive validity standard. Nope, we also know that one's not true. Arguments that meet the reasonable doubt standard are inductive. That's absolutely true. This is an inductive standard, not a deductive standard. Under the reasonable doubt standard, if the premises were true, no reasonable person would doubt that the conclusion is true. This is also correct. The reasonable doubt standard is the inference has to be something that no reasonable person would doubt. And then the reasonable doubt standard is typically used in criminal cases. So that one is also true. So it's these last three. And these are randomized. As you probably figured out by now, the test is randomized. So you're not going to get this exact test, but you might get some of these. So one of the fallacies associated with presumption and standards of evidence and that sort of thing is appeal to ignorance. So here we need to find the correct answer. I'm going to hurry along here. We can rule out ones like fallacious argument that which claims the conclusion must be true because it's widely believed. That's an entirely different fallacy. So here we go. A fallacious argument which asserts that because something hasn't been proven true, it must be false. An illegitimate shifting of the burden of proof, right? So appeal to ignorance was a version of the burden shifting fallacy. The other one, this is circular reasoning, and this is appeal to vanity or appeal to identity. So those are not the right ones. So the remaining test questions are about argument by analogy. We've got two more multiple choice. I'm sorry, we got one more multiple choice, which is about the definitions involved with the parts of an argument by analogy. Remember, I said that when you have an argument by analogy, you always have certain parts. You have a known similarity, an inferred similarity, a reference analog, and a target analog. So this time, known similarity came up. And the answer here is the sides of the comparison are known to have in common, right? So in any argument by analogy, you move from the known similarity, these two things are similar in this way, we know that, to an inferred similarity, where you say, well, I can infer that since our reference analog has this property, the target analog will probably also have this property. All right, you had a bunch of homework problems asking you to distinguish argument analogies used to illustrate and analogies used as arguments. And I gave you some. The idea is that if an analogy is being used to make an argument, you have to have at least two similarities, one known and one inferred. And then all your other examples were typically literary analogies or expressions. So this problem 7 is like that part of the homework. And you have to identify the passage, that's garbled. The passage below is either an argument by analogy or an analogy that is being used in some other way, such as to illustrate. If the passage is an argument by analogy, write the argument in standard form. So driving too fast is playing with fire. This is just an analogy used to illustrate. There's no argument here. It's just one statement. So we can write our analogy used to illustrate. So one mistake that I get from at least one student every semester is you write something ambiguous here, like this is just an analogy. Well, I need to know which kind of analogy it is. Or sometimes people will write what I almost wrote there and had to stop writing, an argument used to illustrate, which kind of mushes together the two ideas. The other common mistake here is to say that it's an argument by analogy, but not write it in standard form. So you need to finish out the instructions. So I'll go back and clean up the instructions to be sure that it works for everyone. The last three questions are passage-based questions where you analyze and evaluate an argument by analogy. So you need to identify the parts of it for number one. You need to write out the argument in standard form for number two. And then you need to use the critical questions for an argument by analogy for part three. So we want to be sure to do all of these. This actually winds up being a fair amount of work, but if you just pay attention to what you're doing, you can follow through on it. So really what we want to do is really thoroughly dissect the arguments in these three paragraphs coming up. So question 8 on this version of the test is a classic argument for the existence of God, known as the argument from design. The argument from design says that the world appears, so often it's called a watchmaker argument. The world appears like a marvelous machine. Machines are built by designers who have a purpose. Therefore, the world was made by a designer. So what we can do is we write out the parts. So for one, we say that the reference analog is a machine. And the target analog, let's keep this closer together, is the world or the universe. Right? That is, the thing we know about in this world are machines, watches. And the thing that we want to infer something about is the whole universe. What we know they both have in common, the known similarity, is that things are designed for a purpose. Okay, this is being slow to come out. Designed for a purpose. The gears of a watch work together to make the arms move regularly. The heart pumps blood, right? Everything seems to be focused, well crafted to have a purpose. So let's write this out as property. So a machine is, the universe is like a machine in that it has parts that are designed for a purpose. Has parts that are designed for a purpose. And then the inferred similarity is that they have a designer. The designer for a watch is a watchmaker. The designer of the universe is God. So now we can write this in standard form. Premise 1 is the premise that asserts that the two things are similar in some known way. The universe resembles a machine in that the parts are designed for a purpose. The heart looks like it pumps blood. The gears of a watch look like they are used to keep time. P2, machines have designers. Conclusion, the universe has a designer, and that designer is God. All right, evaluating this. Well, this could be a whole class. Heck, I've seen people spend whole semesters talking about the argument from design, but we're not going to do any of that. We're just going to try and keep this quick. So Um, in general, we have three questions. Are the premises true? Would the premises support the conclusion? Um, and is there any missing information? And then we've got for these some specific ones that relate to argument by analogy. So the number of reference analogs, the number of similarities. Oops, let's do this again. Number of similarities. Um, relevance of similarities, and then and also the diversity of the reference analogs. And I did those out of order, so let me just go back up. Um, of reference analogs. So not all these questions always apply. I'm going to try and be short about them and then give a more detailed answer for the full explanation. Are the premises true? Sure. Parts of the world look like they were made for a purpose. I'll put my answers in italics. The number of reference analogs. Well, I mean, in some ways, you could say that every machine in the world counts as one, but really, there's just one, the idea of a machine. And therefore, the diversity of the reference analogs, that doesn't apply. The number of similarities. Well, again, you could talk about all the different ways that things seem to be focused to a purpose. But really, we can just say that there's one having a purpose. Um, and then the relevance will say vary. I mean, I think this right now, really, our only experience of things that have a purpose that we can confirm are things that were built by people. I do want to get down to missing information. When it comes to missing information, the relevant question is, are there any dissimilarities? Similarities. Any differences between the reference and the target analog that are being glossed over by the person giving the argument? And this is something that when I teach philosophy of religion, when I teach the existence of God, we talk about a lot. There's a whole dialogue by David Hume on this topic that would go into a great deal. I need to shorten it though. I want to say that the um, one of the classic problems with the argument from design is what we call the problem of evil. The world contains evil. So yeah, it partially looks like the world was made by a benevolent designer. It also partially looks like it was made by an insane sadist. Um, you look out, so in Hume, you just look out into the world and you see that we live in a world made of suffering. So I'm just gonna make this shorter. Not all of the world looks like it was made by a benevolent, benevolent, benevolent designer. Um, There is the problem of evil. Um, some of the world looks like it was um, uh, I'm going to say this, made by a sadist. Why does evil exist? Why are there diseases that kill children? And then the other dissimilarity, the other thing that might block the inference, I'll just leave this under the general question, is of course, um, we now know that evolution by natural selection can also create things that um, appear to have a purpose but are not designed by a designer. So this was not just the this was not meant to be an exercise in theology, although it has become that. And you don't have to agree with my conclusion, my way of analyzing this argument, my evaluation of this argument. Um, uh, I mean, I really like Hume at the end. He says, well, gosh, the world kind of looks like it's made by a designer, and it kind of looks like it wasn't. And so he's left with a state of what we call aporia. He's not completely uh, committed. Okay, in any case, um, the important thing here is that you follow the structure and you understand the meaning of the parts. All right, next up, a political example. And this one's taken from another critical thinking textbook. The comparison here is between Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. Um, so, and the claim is that because they're similar people, they will both get involved in foreign policy disasters. So, one reference analog Reagan, target analog Bush, known similarities Christian conservatives, um, inferred similarities, foreign policy they are Christian conservatives and will have foreign foreign policy disasters. Oh, and this should be inferred similarity. Okay. So, he one asserts that the two things are similar. Reagan and Bush are similar in that they are both, and they emphasize here the dogmatism. So, um, uh, dogmatic Christian conservatives, P2, Reagan got into a foreign policy disaster. It's not spell check for me. Conclusion, Bush will get into a foreign policy disaster. Okay. Now, for part 3, the evaluation. Oh, and I didn't put up an overall evaluation for the previous one. But I'll say overall mixed. Here, let me go up here. I've never, um, unlike some of my colleagues, ever really come to a complete settled opinion about the argument from design. Okay, in any case, I want to copy this part here so we can get all the parts right. Are the premises true? So we go down here now. Okay, so are the premises true? And oh, I wasn't consistent with the italics. I wouldn't take off points if you're not consistent with that sort of thing. So don't worry about it. So I'm going to say yes. Imagine the foreign policy disaster they are referring to is Iran-Contra. And, also both politicians ran as Christian conservatives. So would the premises support the conclusion? Again, we've got one reference analog and one similarity. In this case, though, I'm not sure about the relevance of the similarity, honestly. There we go. Relevance of similarity. Not very. That is to say, Reagan's religious beliefs were not a factor in his foreign policy disasters. He talks about dogmatic Christian conservatism, but the problem with Iran-Contra was simple corruption, lying to you. I don't even know if you've got covered Iran-Contra in your history books. And if you don't have the relevant information here, you can just say something like, I would need to research Reagan's foreign policy disasters to know if his Christian conservatism was relevant for it. But I'm just going to say here, not very. The problem with Iran-Contra was a lack of Christian principles. Because there was lying and corruption. Again, this doesn't, you don't have to agree with my analysis of the 1980s, but that I would say that. Okay, is there any missing information? Yeah, plenty. So it would take a very long time to catalog all the differences between Reagan and Bush. Catalog all the differences between Reagan and Bush. But actually, I think if anything, Reagan came into the presidency better prepared to deal with foreign policy than Bush. He was a better diplomat. I mean, he was a more charming person. He could develop a really good relationship with Gorbachev, for instance. Was in my humble opinion, better at diplomacy. Is this going to... Oh, must see. It's not correcting my spelling. I'm sorry, this is being annoying. That would actually reinforce the conclusion. And, you could say, as it turns out, that the conclusion, you could argue that the conclusion turned out to be true if you want to count the Iraq War as a disaster. You might say not. But interestingly, again, it didn't seem to be connected to anything about Christian conservatism. I would say that even though the premise turned out to be true, the argument is pretty weak. Um, so the difference is I'm not spelling out in a way that would really give you a robust comparison between the two presidents. But I would say that the argument is weak because um, neither foreign policy was driven by Christian principles. All right, one more. Okay, this is again uh, yanked from a textbook. I'm not even sure which um, intervention in Nigeria they were talking about. There's nothing going on there now, but in any case, we'll just imagine. Um, so, so in any case, uh, we've got two primary analogs. So it's part one, reference analogs. Uh, what is it? Human rights violations in Bosnia and Rwanda. Target is some human rights violation, HR violations, human rights rather than human resources, human rights violations in Nigeria. Um, the known similarity isn't spelled out, but we could just say, are human rights violations. And the inferred similarity is that the UN will not intervene. All right, so for two, we can say P1, the situation in Nigeria, and again, I don't know which one they're referring to, is like these situations in Rwanda and Bosnia, in that they involve human rights violations. P2, the UN did not intervene in Rwanda or Bosnia. Conclusion, the UN will not intervene in Nigeria. All right, and now we are back to the evaluation, and I am copy pasting the questions. Um, so go here. Are the premises true? Actually, I'm not sure. Referring to in Nigeria, the situations in Bosnia and Rwanda were famous. Damn it. Bosnia and Rwanda are quite famous. So now we have a number of reference analogs. Two, Diversity of the reference analogs. Actually, I mean, very different people, very different contexts, different cultural contexts. Um, so diversity, very diverse. Relevance, a number of similarities. I'm just going to stick with one because we're just going to count is a human rights violation as one. Relevance of similarities, very missing information. I would need to know more about the particular situation being referred to before I evaluate. Before I find any dissimilarities. So the final conclusion, more information needed. Okay, let's just hit submit. Oh, I missed question 1. But that, or question 11 rather, but that's okay. That was the explain your answers question. I just spent the whole video explaining my answers. Submit. Right. And so 5 questions require grading. That's the 4 short answer questions plus the 11th question, but everything else was correct. So that's how it was supposed to work. Great. So that was the practice test run through. If people have any questions, you can email me.